Hey everyone, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Kelly Marshall, and I'm your host for today's session. We're eager to have all of you join us as we start to talk through all of the important topics as you get ready to go back to school. We will take some time for questions at the end of all of the slides. So if you have those as we go through, please use the Q&A function to enter those, and we'll talk through those at the end. Today, we're talking about Work Comp 101, all things workers' compensation. So a few of the things that we'll talk through today are to understand what drives your work comp costs, some of the common claim trends that you probably see in your own schools, some best practices in managing those workers' compensation claims. We can't, of course, skip over early return to work and all of the benefits and best practices associated with those. We'll talk just a little bit about fraudulent and repeat claimants, as well as the aging workforce. And of course, we'll spend some time talking a little bit about injury prevention and investigation. So we're going to jump right in, starting with understanding your workers' compensation costs. So to first understand, your premium, your base rate, is set by the State Division of Insurance. It's based on recommendations from either your state bureau or NCCI, which is the National Council on Compensation Insurance. The base rates for your insurance premiums reflect the hazards associated with the work exposures for you. So schools would be different from trucking, for example, from manufacturing and so forth. You, as the employer, don't have a whole lot of control over that base rate or any of the premium discount factors. However, what you can control is your experience modifier. So as we start to talk through this, I have a quick question to start with. Which is, do you, as we start to talk about this, know what an EMOD is? Sometimes also called an experience mod, experience modifier, can go by lots of names as we like to use in insurance terms. I'll give you just a minute here to answer that. And it looks like right now we're about 50-50, so that's good. You've come to the right place. Just another second if you haven't had a chance to see that pop up on your screen. Quick yes or no question for you. The good news is if you answered no, we're going to talk about this and you will come away learning what an EMOD is. All right, so it looks like we're split about 50-50. Your experience modifier, which we'll talk about, is based on your own unique history of claim frequency. So simply the number of claims that you have, claim severity, or the costs associated with those claims, and further to that point, any lost time expenses associated with those claims. So experience modification. We know about half of you know what an EMOD is. So for everyone, one more question for you right now is, if you do know what an EMOD is, and now that you maybe know just a little bit about it, do you know what your school's particular experience modifier is? One's a little trickier. So if you don't know your EMOD, you're in good company here. It looks like the majority of us probably don't know what your particular EMOD is, which is okay. You're going to learn a little bit about what that means and why it's important today. So experience modification. Experience modifiers start at a 1.0. That is that average within the industry across the nation. So an example here gives you, based on your 3-year look back at your claims history, what that might look like. So you can see on the left side, if we're talking about a base rate again, not controlled by you, but set by NCCI of $100,000. If you as an employer have an experience mod of 1.0, then you're paying exactly that for your workers' compensation coverage, $100,000. However, in the two other examples that follow here, if you've had a pretty good history of managing your claims, whether it's prevention coupled with a good return to work program, and you've experienced some significant savings on your EMOD and have an EMOD therefore of a 0.8, then that same $100,000 base rate is then $80,000 that you're paying for your workers' compensation insurance. On the flip side, in the bottom example, if you've had some difficult claims, maybe some tough return to work situations, and employees who weren't able to quickly return to work following a work-related injury, and an EMOD therefore of 1.5, for that exact same coverage, as far as your workers' compensation goes, an EMOD of 1.5 means that you're paying $150,000. So you can see how just some simple things that you can do and control within your environment can make a pretty significant impact on your EMOD and therefore your insurance premiums. So what does that mean? Where are those claims and those costs coming from? Two different types of claims that we'll talk about. Medical only, which are those claims where there are no lost time benefits paid to an employee. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a significant claim. Sometimes the only part of this term makes that a little bit misleading. It just means that an employee was able to be accommodated or return to work relatively quickly following a work-related injury. When those costs are reported to NCCI, they look at those medical only claims and discount those by 70%. So only 30% of those actual claim costs are reported and therefore go on to impact your EMOD and your subsequent premiums. On the other end, indemnity claims are work comp claims where lost time wages and benefits and or an impairment or a settlement rating is paid to an injured worker. And when those then are reported to NCCI, those are reported with 100% of that claim cost being considered. So there's no discount being given there. So you can already start to see where the advantages are to returning employees to work as safely as they can following a work-related injury. So speaking of, let's talk about claim reporting and lag days. The goal here is that you as the employer know right away about any kind of work-related injury, that the employee knows that they need to let you know right away, and that you then in turn let RIS, your workers' compensation carrier, know within 24 hours. This is what we consider to be zero lag days. So that time between when you know about the injury, when you're told about the injury, and then when you let us as the carrier know about the injury, that's what that lag time really refers to. The reason this is important is lots of different fold here. So large lag days can raise questions with OSHA about claim hiding and just wondering, so what happened in that time in between? What was going on there? OSHA requires employers to establish a way for employees to report injuries, of course, and they have given fines to employers that are found to have discouraged employees from reporting claims. Early reporting is significant in terms of claim costs as well. So you can see sort of the progression here in the injuries that were reported 11 to 20 days after the date of injury. Those claims, even in that 11-day time period, were a cost of about 29% higher than the average. On the more significant side, employees that reported an injury after 30 days had a claim cost that was nearly 50% higher than the average. So as the days go by, that gets more and more significant. Why this is important is not only so that everybody understands and we know what's going on, that an injury has occurred, but we as the insurance carrier can then start to investigate the claim faster. The claims examiner can help to direct that injured worker for the appropriate medical care, any kind of tests that they might need, additional referrals to specialty, different treatments. And when employees tend to treat sort of on their own before they report a claim, those medical costs can skyrocket. We sometimes then learn about a claim when it's at the point that an employee needs surgery, and we may have had the opportunity to intervene with a less intrusive treatment and a less costly treatment sooner had we known. A simple injury, what could start as a simple injury, can become much more serious if that treatment is delayed, and especially if the employee does continue to work and it continues to just exacerbate that injury. There's also the risk that employees will get upset, may seek some sort of an attorney earlier on, and those attorneys can claim an attorney's fee then for denial of care without a reasonable basis. So you as the employer, your best claim response here is to truly just help the injured employee navigate through the claim system. And the best way for you to do that is to understand what is going to happen and why. So it's important that you take charge from the beginning and realize that you're kind of setting the tone for how this whole episode and the claim will go. It's important that you continue to let the employee know that you're concerned about their well-being and support them. Just practice the golden rule. Treat them the way that you would want to be treated if you were in that situation. We get this question a lot about fraudulent workers' compensation claims, and I would tell you that truly it's probably less common, fortunately, than you think that it might be. If that's something that you suspect, that's not your job. That's the job of the claims examiner, is to investigate the claim to determine if that truly is something that should be workers' compensable. But you should continue to support the employee and to communicate what you know. So especially in those cases, we want to make sure that we investigate that injury and that situation thoroughly, and then that you let us know everything that you know. So if you know that the employee was playing softball on Sunday and then they came to work with a Monday morning injury, that's something that's important for us to know as well. That claim investigation will continue to gather all of the details to help make the best decision about not only the course of action, but the course of treatment for getting that worker the best care that they can get. It's also important for both you and you as the employer to stay on top of those claims. It can help to have a really strong return to work program, which we'll talk in more detail about as well. How about repeat claimants? So these are those frequent flyers, we often call them, or think that they are simply accident prone types of people. These people need to be supported as well. So this isn't necessarily someone who's a bad person or a bad employee. They might just not be in the right position. So if you have an employee who is involved in, usually we would say 3 or more claims, that might be a good time to start looking at job reassignment or task reassignment in order to avoid any future claims. You may also need to look at thinking about a fitness for duty assessment after a claim has been resolved to truly see if that job, those tasks, are a good match with what the employee is able to safely physically do. If medical treatment is necessary in the course of that claim response, make sure that you communicate any availability of modified duty with the doctor that's treating that injured worker. If they have a good understanding of what the employee is required to do, and that you are willing to accommodate that employee to get them back to work as soon as is safely possible, then you have a much better chance of getting a good happy medium there where we're able to find some modified duty options for the employee that keeps both them coming to work, but also them continuing to heal and to get the care that they need while they are continuing to work. You should also make sure that you're reviewing your expectations with that injured worker. They need to understand that after every medical visit, they should be communicating with both you and also with their claims examiner, and that they should return any calls or even texts that they might be getting. It's important that they communicate with HR and then also with our claims representative, both promptly and honestly. They are still an employee of yours. They're not only a patient at this point, but you want to try to balance those two roles closely. And one of the notes I would make here is that, especially in this day and age, when we have any of us, myself included, a call or a message from an unknown number, We're probably guilty of sending that call to voicemail or not checking that voicemail, but just make sure you're letting your employees know that they will be getting calls and they should be communicating with their claims representative as well. So we can't talk about work comp, as I mentioned, without talking about return to work and why. If you don't know why, we're going to spend some time talking about why stay at work and return to work programs are very significant. Let's start by talking about some of the benefits of a strong return to work program, which of course is lower costs. So not only does this mean a lower insurance premium, it means lower costs, of course, for lost time and wages that you're paying your injured workers. So your goal here should be to bring everybody back to work as soon as is safely possible. With no lost time, that's where you are achieving that discounted claim cost at NCCI by 70%. When in turn, you have an injured worker that you are paying lost wage benefits, that full cost is being reported to NCCI, so 100% of that claim cost. And not only is that significant at the time of that claim, but that also continues to follow you as that EMOD will impact your premium negatively, in this case, for 3 years down the road. We also know that in addition to cost, when we are able to bring injured workers back to work sooner, they have a shorter injury recovery time, and overall they have better medical outcomes. We know that they recover better and faster if they can stay active and engaged in their life, their normal work tasks, as much as possible during and after the time that they're receiving medical care. Work can become part of their therapy. So we all know, probably even from just being sick for a couple of days here and there, that the longer that you are inactive or that you lay in bed trying to recover, the harder it gets to go back to those normal daily tasks. So we start to experience just that loss of muscle tone and endurance when we're not active for a couple of days. So modifying an injured worker's work assignments or tasks or daily hours even can be part of their rehab process, and it can help bridge them from nothing to everything that they were doing before they had the work-related injury. It can also help to build confidence in the employee and also you and the employer to understand that they're able to maybe continue to do some of these tasks or things that they were doing before. And you have the confidence to understand that you can safely bring them back and they can continue to contribute in some way. And it's not simply the off work or back at work again. Early return to work, we know this from the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons. And if you've worked with orthopedic surgeons, you know that they can be a tough crowd. They even tell us that in terms of early return to work, it is truly in the patient's best interest. It helps them to regain some function and prevent some of the deconditioning that happens. It also avoids a negative psychological behavior pattern where we start to experience just a change in how we perceive our own roles and our behaviors. Helps to maintain their quality of life and avoids for the employee as well any of the downfalls of prolonged time off of work when they aren't earning their full wage benefits. Can also help to reduce the interruption, as I mentioned, of their employee income. So when we are able to bring employees back to work and receiving their full wage benefits, they don't see that same disruption in their take-home wages, even their benefit accumulations, or any of their other benefits they may be experiencing, like their retirement package accruals. Another benefit can be to limit any hidden agendas which might impact someone's recovery and motivation. So as I mentioned, we know that the longer that someone is off of work, the more motivated they become to remain off of work. Because what happens during the day when we're not at work? If you've ever been home during the day and watching daytime TV, you probably have a pretty good idea of what sorts of ads come on during the day. And that's what we start to see. That becomes the topics, the conversations that are floating around in our head. And it can pretty quickly interrupt the way that we think about our own roles and having the motivation to get back to those work-related roles. It may also mean that an injured worker interrupt some of their other normal daily tasks and habits, like removing their kids from daycare or other daily routines, even simply the act of taking kids to and from school or daycare. And that might change when that doesn't mean that mom or dad is going straight to school themselves after having dropped their kids off at daycare or school. Can create a disruption for the whole family just in the normal flow of what that daily family activity looks like. And those disruptions in daily routines can become difficult to reverse. So, similar to a habit, it takes a while to build up a habit, but it can also be disrupted pretty quickly too. Another benefit of early return to work is improving the employer and employee communication, which therefore can help to decrease stress. When your employees are coming to school, they're present, so you can talk to them, right? They come through the door every morning. They are able to talk with you to stay in that normal routine. You can keep an eye on what's going on. They have the concerns over any kind of potential loss of the job overall, that's decreased when they're continuing to come. They're keeping that place, they're keeping that normal routine, the communication with supervisors and with coworkers, and they know that they're still part of the loop. They don't lose that habit and that sense of identity as a worker that comes to work every day. We know that prolonged time away from work is harmful for the employee. So again, going back to this American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, they tell us that prolonged absence from someone's normal role, including absence from the workplace, isn't good for their mental, physical, and social well-being. In fact, the odds of someone returning to work drop by 50% by the time that they're away from work by just 12 weeks. So when you think about this in terms of a significant injury or a surgical recovery, that can happen pretty quickly. And after we cross that threshold of 12 weeks away from work, then the odds of bringing them back to work get pretty slim. It can, as I mentioned, disrupt their daily predictable life. You start to lose those relationships with coworkers, those simple check-ins that you're used to every day to say, hey, how was your weekend? Or how was the game last night? Employees who are no longer going to work can start to lose, as I mentioned, not only their sense of identity, but the respect that they may have for themselves from being maybe the breadwinner or earning a living, bringing home some of those benefits for their family. The negative financial impact as well. And truly their focus becomes starting to justify their time away from work, as opposed to truly being very motivated to get back to gainful employment. The ACOEM also tells us that approximately 75% of all lost time claims, again, those where an injured worker is being paid lost time wage benefits, they're actually not medically necessary. So instead, they're related to things like administrative delays when a treatment to a specialty referral needs to happen, and just that lag time in between that coordination. Ineffective communications. If you've dealt with medical and insurance folks, you probably have a pretty good understanding of what this can look like. So we have so many different people in the mix here. Communications between the injured worker, you as the employer, any kind of additional employer contacts, us as the insurance carrier, all of the medical providers, and then anybody else you throw into that mix, perhaps a case manager or a therapist, for example. We have lots of different communication balls that can get dropped here, and that can lead to unnecessary delays in treatment. Having a lack of transitional work with your school, for example, can also lead to delays in treatment. And truly just kind of that lax management of a claim, not keeping on top of those things to know what needs to happen next, what communications need to happen, and what steps we need to go through here to make sure that we're getting the employee the best care in a timely manner and we're bringing them back to work. Other problems can then start to masquerade as some sort of a medical issue. So maybe someone who was dissatisfied with their job already, or who was unhappy with whether it's a coworker relationship or a supervisor relationship, or have simply some fear, whether it's about returning to work and being re-injured or fear of the unknown. Those can start to exacerbate themselves as medical issues just the longer that this goes on. So you can see how just that early return to work not starting to go down that road can be very beneficial. Time away from work, however, is sometimes truly medically required, and that includes times like a hospital admission or somewhere that an employee may need to be placed in care that's medically required. Any kind of confinement to a bed or home, oftentimes that means that even in the virtual and remote world, that might just mean that truly some time away from work is going to need to be medically necessary. And even when being in the workplace might have a specific hazard to the injured worker or to coworkers in the public. So what does this look like in terms of returning to work safely? We have a couple of different situations here, and we'll talk through these. Ideally, you want your injured worker to come back to exactly what they were doing. If they were a paraprofessional, you want them to come back to being a paraprofessional and to doing all of the tasks that they were used to doing with their kiddos throughout the day. Working the same hours that everyone's in school, the same shift, for example. We might, however, have to start all the way at the bottom here, where we have someone who might need to work, whether it's limited hours or different hours entirely. They might need to be doing something away from kiddos, and we might need to find a different department or an area of the school for them to work in, for example, before you can start to work your way back up the continuum here. The goal is always to get those injured employees back to the top of the pyramid, which is working the same job, the same position, the same hours that they were working before they experienced the work injury. But in the meantime, we might need to work our way up the ladder here and come up with some different options that will help to accommodate them during their healing process. So before we need to talk about return to work, it's equally as important to talk about injury prevention. So with injury prevention, we can eliminate this whole talk of return to work and finding accommodations for an injured worker because we don't have to worry about that happening in the first place. So let's talk a little bit about this. It is equally important for you to focus your time and your energies on injury prevention. And to do that, you need to know where your injuries are coming from. So I will give you a couple of hints here, but if you don't already know, it's important to know where your injuries are being caused from and where they're happening, whether that's by location, so maybe your different schools, by department, and then even within each of those things by position. Here's your hint. If you don't know where your claims are coming from, these two are probably leading the list. So strains and sprains and slips and falls are two of the largest claim causes and costs for schools across the board, whether it's in the Midwest, the South, any different part of the country, big or small schools. Strains and sprains and slips and falls are significant in claim causes for employees in schools across the board. So if we want to talk about prevention, we need to understand why and be proactive about how those claims are happening. These are some questions to start to think through. Do you know where your employees are slipping and falling? And if you don't, that's something that we can help with. But understanding first where it's coming from, when, why, where, can help you to better monitor any kind of practices or put some prevention items in place to help make sure that those things aren't happening. Slip and fall awareness campaigns can be significant as well, and we have lots of materials to help you with those. Posters can be helpful in reminding staff about some of the hazards of slips and falls as well. If you don't already, a footwear policy may be a good idea, especially for employees in certain departments. So things like food services, environmental, building and grounds, it might be a good idea to look at a footwear policy for those particular employees. In the Midwest in particular, sidewalk and parking lot care can be pretty significant during our winter weather conditions, and to make sure that you have good policies and procedures and expectations in place around those things. General housekeeping can, of course, reduce the potential of slip and fall injuries as well. So this is a good visual for you of overall causes of slips and falls. So you can see the blue portion here is simply the walkway surface. Another big chunk of this puzzle is footwear. So we talked already about that, but to understand both what the safety practices are that you have in place for keeping those walkway surfaces clear of any slip, fall, trip hazards, and then to look at, is a footwear policy something that might be significant in helping to reduce those injuries in maybe different departments across your schools. To hit on the other common cause of injuries in schools, let's talk a little bit about strain injury prevention. So the same question applies here. Do you know when, how, where those strains are happening? Do you have a strain reduction program? And do your policies support strain reduction? So you can imagine this might be a little bit more significant for certain departments than others, but it certainly doesn't discriminate against even those classroom teachers and paraprofessionals that might have been those who are experiencing significant strain injuries. Talk about what your best practices are and continue to talk about things like that, both at the time of coming back to school each fall, at the time that you hire new employees, and to remind them about that throughout the school year. It's also a good time to talk about accident investigation in helping to determine the root cause of an injury. If you don't already have something like that in place, we can help with that as well. This visual talks a little bit about musculoskeletal injuries, which can be significant as well in things like repetitive stress types of claims. So I wanted to talk about this just for a minute so that you recognize this one as well. Musculoskeletal injuries are things like carpal tunnel and cubital tunnel sorts of injuries, and those can be more difficult to identify, but equally important, especially as we see more and more people working on computer screens these days. Musculoskeletal injuries can become significant at the point in time where you come all the way full circle here and you have an employee who maybe isn't starting to have any kind of recovery from their symptoms. So sometimes those can be something where someone has just some symptoms while they're working, maybe while they're at their desk, while they're filling out lesson plans or doing grades or something like that at the end of the week or the end of the day. But the point in time in which you have a teacher perhaps who is no longer having any kind of recovery from their symptoms is the point at time when that becomes significant enough to make sure that you're reporting that as a potential for work comp claim consideration. Muscle fatigue and strain, discomfort, pain, and disability can be warning signs for musculoskeletal injuries. It's important, as we talked about, not only early reporting, but of course, early identification. Employees should be encouraged to take responsibility for their own health and their work environments as well. Make sure that they know what that process is and encourage them to report any kind of concerns or discomfort before it gets so bad that they need medical attention. There may be situations where some preventative care might be helpful in helping to avoid an actual work-related injury. Not only is it the individual's responsibility, but if you don't have one, I would encourage you to consider a safety committee and to encourage maybe some safety huddles. This might be more department specific. So as we think about your kitchen and dietary staff or your building and grounds folks, those can be places where it can be very impactful for them to have a safety huddle to talk about prevention before they take on the work of the day. They should be aware of reporting any safety concerns. They may be the front line for addressing those safety concerns and to understand the significance of the work that they do in helping to keep everyone else in your school safe. From the perspective of the supervisor, in the claim response situation, this is where it's important to understand that accident investigation can be very significant, not only in managing a claim, but in preventing future claims. That starts with identifying the root cause of why an accident or an injury really happened. It can be, as I mentioned, very effective at preventing future injuries, and it can help to decrease the risk of a claim being fraudulent. Helps to shift that focus back on safety and your culture, and it makes sure that your employees then understand that safety is something that you take seriously. The supervisor is the person who can be the most effective in that injury investigation process. Usually they're the one who's the closest to the employee. They know how the day goes for that employee. They know what their general operations are. They're also the best person to enforce safety, and they generally are responsible for some of the training of those employees. So briefly, let's talk a little bit about accident investigation and why this is something that is important to consider and that may be something that you're being asked to do at various times. It's important to interview and investigate an accident as soon as that happens. We all know not only that environment can change very quickly, but also that our memories can change quickly. And so it becomes more and more difficult, not only for the injured employee, but maybe any other employees who may have witnessed an accident to be able to accurately report what happened at the time of the accident. Make sure that employees know that you're going to be asking questions after they've shared their story. Then make sure they understand that you need to better understand why an accident happened, that you'll continue to look at what those causes really are to help to prevent any future accidents or injuries that might be similar. Lots of why questions come up as we're investigating accidents to help, again, get to truly identify the root cause of an accident. Most accidents happen because of unsafe conditions or unsafe acts. And let me talk to you just a little bit about what that really means. Unsafe acts are things that people do. So when they are engaging in horseplay or they aren't using personal protective equipment that they've been advised to use, that maybe they aren't following the procedures that have been outlined for them or using equipment that might be available for them to lift properly, for example. When employees make safety devices inoperable, or they don't warn other folks or report hazards that might be occurring in the workplace. Those are things that are considered to be unsafe acts. Reasons for this? It could be simply that an employee doesn't know how to do their job safely. Maybe they weren't trained. Maybe they've forgotten. We all know that during initial training and orientation, we get lots of things thrown our way. So it's important that they have that ongoing reminder and training to know how to do those jobs safely. Could also be the case that there is not enforcement of any safety rules. So we all know that once a rule is not enforced, it becomes virtually unnecessary, because if we get away with it once, we're going to continue to try to avoid following that rule in the future. Can also be simply due to a poor attitude or complacency. So as employees start to get complacent about the work that they do, they simply lose the ability to care for performing those jobs, those duties safely. Could also be poor communication, or as I mentioned, the lack of physical ability to perform the demands of their job. This can be due to lots of different things, whether it is some sort of a limited ability, but even a limited strength or range of motion, which we'll talk a little bit about in terms of the aging workforce as well. Active or degenerative conditions, therefore, if an employee demonstrates difficulty doing the essential functions of their job, for whatever reason this might be, make sure that you first let HR know, if that's your role and responsibility, and that you document any of those observations or concerns that you have about the employee so that that can become part of their permanent file. Make sure that information, however, is objective and that it's focused on what the essential duties of their job truly are. If there are accommodations being made, then we want to make sure that those are being considered as well, so that it doesn't simply become something that becomes commonplace and we start to think that that's the way the job is done instead of just the way that an employee may be doing the job. It's also important that we don't allow those unsafe conditions to exist. So as I mentioned, lots of times our environmental services folks, our building and grounds folks can be key in making these changes. Environmental changes that might need to be made in terms of, fixing a trip hazard or cleaning up a spill on the floor. Equipment changes that might need to happen, scheduling changes, even responsibility changes. So if someone needs increased supervision, for example, does a protocol or a policy need to be changed? Or does it simply just need to be enforced or enforced more regularly? Improved communication is always a good action item. And oftentimes it also means that we might need to look at more frequent training. Continue to focus on that positive enforcement to motivate safety as opposed to repercussions for not following some of those safety items. List the actions that can be taken to prevent that injury, that accident from happening over and over again, and make sure it's clear that you know who's responsible for implementing those actions. Having a time frame is also essential to make sure that we can follow up and know that those action items are being completed. It's important here that you have some responsibility for overseeing and following up. So HR or a safety committee can be very critical as part of this process. And to make sure that changes that we've identified have in fact been made. Make sure then you can follow that process along to say, are we using these strategies and are they working? And to circle back to follow up again with employees and supervisors as well. So if we don't know what happened, for example, we don't know our claim trends, we don't know where they're coming from or why or when, then we put ourselves into that perpetual cycle of just continuing to repeat those same claim trend patterns. Therefore, thorough accident investigation can be very significant in terms of preventing future workers' compensation claims. So bottom line is here, how do you help reduce your workers' compensation costs? Get those injuries reported right away. Make sure that your employees know who to report injuries, when, why, and what they should be reporting. And then what happens if a supervisor is the one who takes that report of information, make sure that they know what to do with that next. Good claims management is also key. So communication cannot be overstressed here, both with HR, with the injured worker, with the supervisor, and also with the claims representative that might be handling a workers' compensation claim. Prompt return to work is incredibly significant. So as much as possible, we want to make sure that we're reducing those indemnity claims, that you have some ideas, that you have some thoughts about bringing injured workers back to work. And if you don't already, I would encourage you to keep a list. So if you have an injured worker and you've got a few ideas or things that have worked in the past, maybe some tasks, maybe some projects that you can use as accommodation options. We also have lists of those for schools specifically that are available on the RAS portal if you need some help getting started with developing some light duty or modified duty task ideas. And I can't stress enough that we don't have to worry about any of this if we focus instead on injury prevention. So the more that you can focus on preventing those injuries from happening in the first place, the less we have to worry about what that reporting process looks like, what the management of the claim process looks like, worrying about any kind of return to work options or alternative duty types of accommodations, investigating accidents. We simply prevent those injuries in the first place. So while you have probably had enough of workers' compensation 101 for today, if you've not already, I would encourage you to check out the rest of the sessions in our back to school series coming up this week. We've got something for nearly every department. So nutrition and dietary services, your kitchen staff, your building grounds, your custodial staff, classroom teachers and paraprofessionals, and a little bit about some of those challenging student behaviors, and even your transportation staff. If you do have any questions, now is a good time for you to pop those into the Q&A function. Each of these webinars will be available on our YouTube channel and also through the RAS portal. So if there's someone that hasn't been on that you think would benefit from this information, please feel free to share that with them. And if you don't have any questions, we'll hope to see you for the rest of our sessions later this week. Thanks, everyone.